Thank you very much. It's great to see all of you here. I'd also like to pay tribute to the other editors of the report, one of whom is here. Fred Kruger is in the audience from Erlangen University, but there's also Lisa Schipper, who has an affiliation now at ODI here, and Greg Bankoff, who's from the University of Hull. And the four of us have been working for about 5 years now on looking at disaster risk reduction in the context of culture. We've held 2 conferences, and we'll have an academic book next year on this topic as well. And I'm saying that because we really take this very seriously. And so we do hope that the report is useful to people. There are a number of resources on the IFRC website linked to it, including an animation, which I'd like to show now as a kind of an introduction to the report.
Culture is a major factor affecting how people and organizations deal with disasters, and yet it is often ignored. Hundreds of millions of people live in danger zones, affected by hazards such as floods, cyclones, earthquakes, and volcanoes. For many people, their religious and other beliefs give them the psychological security needed to live with danger. However, their perceptions and attitudes can also increase their vulnerability. Whether preparing for an earthquake or deciding to wear a seatbelt, culture can play a significant role in how people treat risks and sometimes hinder disaster prevention. A new approach is needed to help disaster organizations take culture into account. We need to assess 2 types of culture: that of the people who are vulnerable to disasters, people's culture, and the culture of disaster risk reduction organizations, or organizational culture. We also need to examine how these 2 cultures can clash, making risk reduction less effective. We must understand the wide variety of behaviors of people who are at risk, some of which appear to outsiders to be irrational. This means moving beyond conventional frames of reference of the disaster sector and benefiting from psychology, sociology, anthropology, public health, and behavioral economics. It also means confronting the difficult questions that these different rationalities pose for disaster preparedness. We need a more comprehensive, people-centered approach in order to ensure that future disaster risk reduction interventions are culturally sensitive, more acceptable to local people, and therefore ultimately more effective.
I think that says it all. So what I'm going to be doing is expanding on that a bit and provoking maybe some more discussion and questions. I think the key point comes across in the film that disaster and risk recovery and climate adaptation projects will fail, or are already failing, when they ignore how people behave in relation to risk. We really have to understand people's attitude to risk, the embeddedness of risk in attitudes to risk in people's culture and everyday lives. So we need that new approach. Now the problem is that culture is complex. And this diagram actually is from one of the conferences we held in Germany last year, and it depicts the complexity of dealing with culture in relation to disaster risk. Now, in the report, we don't cover everything about culture at all, because it is a huge topic. So we've been very pragmatic. We've adopted a definition of culture which is looking at how it is relevant to people's attitude to risk. And there's no one single definition of culture. We've used our own, which is risk-oriented culture, idea about culture. But what we do know is that everything that is related to risk is embedded in people's attitudes, beliefs, and so we have to take it seriously. And one of the things we have to take seriously is that the vast majority of the world's population are religious. And if they're religious, what does this mean for how we try to attempt to engage in disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation? It would be a pretty pointless religion that does not have anything to say about disasters. And in fact, all religions, and you could even say that many religious beliefs are actually incorporated around the idea of risk, that religion exists partly to enable people to live with risk. So it's really quite important that we take that into account. And these attitudes to risk come in a variety of flavors, which I won't have time to talk about, but you will all know of fatalism. There's ideas of predestination, ideas that disasters are punishment from God or gods. And we have many examples of this in the report, ranging from, for example, the people who live in Bihar on the river Kosi, who blamed the disaster on their bad behavior, and the goddess Kosi, after whom the river is named, was punishing them. So their disaster risk reduction strategy is to pray more and make more offerings to the goddess. I think we'd all hesitate to putting that as a funding request to DFID or another donor. But this is what we have to take seriously, and it isn't just exotic people in strange cultures overseas. After the Hurricane Katrina, a very significant proportion of the local people who were affected believed that God was punishing them, and a number of other religious leaders in the country were saying it was God's punishment. So I think we have to really take into account that there are many ways in which people have what appear to be irrational beliefs, which we must take into account. And if we don't take them into account now, how much worse will be with climate change as vulnerability increases and as disaster risks are increased through severity or frequency. So the beliefs and attitudes lead to particular ways of perceiving risk. All perceptions of risk, whether it is as simple as putting on your seatbelt or preparing for an earthquake, are embedded in people's daily experience of their culture. And the priorities that they have are also related to where they have to live and the cultures that enable them to live, for example, in dangerous places. And in most parts of the world, most people give hazards, what we would call severe hazards, very low priority. And that's one thing that we deal with in the report, is that how do we actually do DRR when people are not interested in DRR, in the major disaster risks? And I'll come back to that in a minute. So the future of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation must be much more people-centered and culturally sensitive. But we must avoid thinking of culture, as Tim said, it's not like a fixed menu, it's dynamic, it changes. And that is something that we can have hope for, because there are examples in the report that suggest that people do change their cultures. And this can be a positive thing in order for change for disaster preparedness can happen. Just like risk, culture has no universal definition or understanding, risk has many different understandings and definitions. But risk is always perceived and produced through the lens of culture. People perceive risk in accordance with their worldview. And we have to understand whose perception is important. So I'm going to use exactly the same landscape. Here it is with opportunities. With risks. This one is showing the risks. So you've got faults and earthquakes, you've got glacier lake outbursts, landslides, volcanoes, flood risk. So the disaster risk organizations look at the landscape and this is what they see. Okay, whereas the people see opportunities. They see fishing, a fertile land for farming, and a culture clash, if you like, between two different perceptions coming out of the cultures of the different institutions and people who are wanting to live and deal with risk. Now, so the organizations have culture too, because the organizations are looking at the landscape in a very, very different way. And we're building on parallel studies on this, and some of you will have seen Ben Ramalingam's book, Aid in Chaos, which is also a very good analysis of institutional culture in relation to the humanitarian sector. And about 6 months ago, some of you might have been in the room here when Rao of Mansouri and Rao launched their book from the World Bank on participation and the problem of participation and cultures of understanding that. So it's very good to see some convergence going on around these changing ideas, because we need to get this embedded. Now, this is an extreme example. This is from a PhD done in La Paz in Bolivia, where you find these houses which are quite extraordinary on these very dangerous slopes. And the PhD student, Fabian Nathan, who did this work here, has, as you can see, interviewed all these people, and they come up with perfectly rational ways of living with risk. They're in this extremely dangerous environment, but they all think they're safe, because they can devise stories which are also supported by religion, and they would rather spend money on a new football field than on disaster risk reduction. There are priorities going on here which, if we looked at that, we would think you're crazy. But they have ways of finding analysis of their own lives which make it possible for them to live with these risks. So people's beliefs and practices must be factored into disaster management, even if they are perceived by us, by disaster agencies, as being obstacles to reducing vulnerability. We have to take them seriously. And one of the key things that organizations' culture does is to have a view of people as being a bit crazy for living in dangerous places. And we really have to, there's a chapter in the report that looks at the priority that people give to livelihoods. And if you go around the world, almost every single NGO, and the Red Cross and the Red Crescent, does these community risk assessments. In the Red Cross and Red Crescent, it's called the Vulnerability Capacity Assessment. All NGOs have their own version of this, and thousands of them have been done around the world, and we are aware that 99% of those risk assessments, the people do not give priority to earthquakes, volcanoes, hurricanes, tsunamis, or any of those things that the DRR institution thinks they should be paying attention to. And one of the most extreme examples was from some of the students in Copenhagen who had a field trip to the Sundarbans in southwest Bangladesh in 2010, where they had just had a cyclone in 2009 and another one in 2007, and they asked the people in one village, what are your risks? And the people said the first is the water is too salty, salinization. The second is we get attacked by pirates, and the third is we get eaten by tigers. And they didn't mention cyclones. And this pattern is repeated all over the world, that the risks that people talk about are not the ones that the DRR organizations are interested in. As Ben Ramalingam says in his book, quoting an NGO, he says, why don't they want what we can give them? And this is, you know, it's the old story of if all you've got is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And we have this culture clash between the organizations that want to support people, quite understandably, from a humanitarian perspective, and the people themselves who are living with other risks. Their daily risks are more important than the one that might not come for 5 or 10 years. And this is part of the institutional culture that we really need to self-examine. Another part of the institutional culture is what we call the myth of community. Community, I would be provocative and say there's no such thing as community. What I mean by that is that whenever we want to use the term community, we should actually think, what do we mean by it? It's become an institutional, a cultural idea that we can invoke community because it suggests we're down there with the people at the grassroots, doing the right thing, we're people focused and so on. But every single community is divided 50-50, very obviously on gender grounds. And a recent study by the United Nations has provides some evidence that 30% of women in the world have been subject to physical or sexual abuse. In other words, whenever we go to a community, what we should be remembering is that it is divided 50-50, and in it women have much less opportunity, females get less nutrition, less healthcare, less education, less job opportunities, and less rights to control and own assets. And unless we think about this so-called community as not being fluffy and cuddly, it is full of tension and conflict, we will not be doing our work correctly. So we need to re-examine our cultural understanding as organizations, why do we invoke community when it's a falsehood? And I'll come back and justify that a bit more, because it might be one of the things that people want to discuss. There's a chapter also on settlement and construction, which looks at the way in which existing cultures, traditional cultures, can provide safer homes than modern ones. Now, there's nothing wrong with good, well-constructed, modern reinforced concrete structures. They can be designed to be earthquake and storm resistant. That's absolutely fine. But the problem is that they're not constructed properly in many cases. And one of the arguments in that is that what we need to restore and rethink about how to protect and recover ideas of traditional cultures in construction in order to possibly make buildings safer, if we cannot trust the modern ones to be constructed properly because of cost or corruption or bad management. There's also a chapter on the issue of health, which, as has already been indicated by Tim in the introduction, is deeply embedded in culture. People's thinking and beliefs about illness and disease cannot be isolated from their thinking about culture, their everyday practice of culture. Now, the book actually, the Ebola crisis came after we went to press with the book, but the example in the book is HIV/AIDS, in which there are many parallels in this process. Another problem of the institutional culture is that we all tend to think if we provide information that will solve many problems. But information is always received within the context of people's existing beliefs, political, cultural, and other beliefs. In other words, information is not going to be the answer to the problem. We think it's good because we all thrive on information. We use it, we think we are using evidence, and so on. But we cannot assume that providing information is enough. Information is always received within the existing beliefs and practices of the people and is interpreted through that. It is locally interpreted by what people already think about things and is not how we think they should be using it. So we need to move beyond conventional disaster risk reduction. We need to do that and get it right for climate change as well. And this means that we have to invest understanding in different rationalities. And in chapter 7, the final chapter, there's quite a lot of guidance. We think it's useful guidance on how this should be done, both for organizations to understand people's culture and for organizations to understand their own culture. And this means that we have to change the frames of reference of what we do in our work in humanitarian and disaster risk reduction organizations. And sorry, that one's got out of phase. So I'll finish now and hand back to the panel. And I hope that that's going to provoke quite a lot of questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Terry. That was a very interesting presentation, and I have to say, having read through the book over the weekend, it's also extremely readable. You know, often when a 275-page document lands on your desk, you might read the executive summary, but I think everyone will find this one very, very interesting to read indeed.
Thank you.